Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad so many people are here at this moment in the conference, 4 o'clock Friday. So, heartily welcome to all of you. I'm Arno Lodder from the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. I'm a professor in internet law and also of counsel at Solve Lawyers. And on behalf of Solve Lawyers, I'm presenting here to give the panel a more mixed flavor than academics only, or whatever. There are more than only academics there, by the way. I want to start with a little anecdote in the series Granddaddy is Talking. One of the best presentations I ever saw was by, I'm not sure about his name, but I'm almost sure it's Peter Johnson. It was in 1999 in Oslo at the International Conference of Artificial Intelligence and Law. And he presented without PowerPoint for like 40 minutes. And during the whole 40 minutes, you were listening to him, and it was really amazing what he was talking about in a very, very good way. And one of the things he was a director of a company producing software that helped civil servants in Australia to give employment benefits to people. And one of the things he was telling that the civil servants, if they didn't like the outcome of the system, so the computer said no, that it just tweaked the input a bit. So for instance, there's this woman getting this employment benefit, and you think, she doesn't deserve it. Tweak a bit. Or the other way around, of course, that you think the system says she shouldn't get it, but then you want to give her this employment benefit, so then they tweaked a bit the input, and then the output became what they wanted the output to be. And I think that 20 years later, so today, with all those algorithms, it becomes more and more difficult to play with the system and even to understand the system. And that's basically what we're going to address in this panel. So the use of algorithms by governments in decisions they make that impact the citizens, and what norms you could apply to sort of guarantee that what the government is doing is good, and what the government is doing, they know about themselves, what they're doing. So these kind of questions we will address. And for that purpose, we have a very good panel. Really fits in with the mantra, save the best for last as a panel. Marlies van Eck is from Leiden University, and she did write a PhD on similar topics, automatic decision making by governments a couple of years ago. Tom Korman works for the European Parliament on the topics we address this session. Then Helene Jansen is working at the Ministry of Interior and Kingdom Relations. And also worked on the topic of algorithms for at least a year, maybe longer, at Cambridge University to do research. And finally, Jennifer Kobbe is working at Cambridge University. So that's so we start with a real academic, and then we end with a real academic, and in between we have. So this is sort of, and I'm both in a way in this very interesting introduction. Let's go to the panelists. They all have 10 minutes maximum. After 8 minutes, I stand up, and after 10 minutes, I start singing. So we will see what will happen. So we will have plenty of room left for discussion after the panelists introduce the topic. Marlies.
Yeah, I can't sit down. I'm too tired, and it's already so late. So let me try to lift the spirit up a bit. We all want that I stretch it out until 10 minutes, right? We want to see him singing, or am I the only one? No, we want it. All right, I produced some super duper slides. I call it myself only to give it a bit of juicy stuff, because we are dealing here with very serious matters, the use of algorithms by the government. And until recently, that was supposed to be the domain of data protection lawyers only. And I'm from administrative law, and I wanted to address automated decision-making from the administrative law principles, or at least the administrative law glasses. However, I started my career working for Data Protection Authority back in the days last century, and it's such a pleasure to see some of my former colleagues here, to see them were still up and running. Yeah, please. The next slide. Oh, of course I can use my own clicker. So, if we are talking about automated decision making, it's very tempting to say they are new, it's a new phenomenon. Oh yeah, these algorithms, oh, they're so new. No, it's not, especially not in the Netherlands. We have them since the 60s. That was the first computer conscious lawmaking we had. It was to pay motor driving taxes. We had to design a system because, you know, more people got more cars and the tax administration couldn't keep up with all those new taxable persons. So we have it, and certainly in the 80s, all the large organizations started automating their decisions. So I wrote a thesis, but I was announced as an academic, but I'm a practitioner by origin, and I worked at the tax administration, responsible, and I was defending the tax administration in courts, and I was telling judges that the decisions were sound and trustworthy. However, when I did so, I didn't feel very comfortable because in my office, I couldn't really check if the computer did what I thought it was doing, and we couldn't even convince the system sometimes to rule, to give a decision the judge said we had to do. So we did have to tweak the system, but we would call it manipulation in another way, to make the system do what the judges say it did, and that's what my interest came from, and I wanted to study. I wanted to know more. Well, it's in Dutch, but it's about legal protection, and I did an empirical study, meaning that I didn't do a legal point study, because otherwise my question was, how is it with legal protection? I could look at the law books, they haven't changed for all decades, so the conclusion would be, yeah, there is no problem, but I wanted to see for myself, so I observed daily practice. So the bad news, it's in Dutch. The good news, it's open access. I have an English summary. I'm working on an international article, and you can download it. And we even have a YouTube film. I'm so proud of it. We have this in the Netherlands. It's University for the Netherlands, so you have to talk about your topic in plain Dutch with nice pieces of animations in a nightclub. And it's recorded, and I've made the subtitles in English so my students can listen to it, but it's in a very plain way explained how it works in the Netherlands. So I wanted to study legal protection, and legal protection, that's something else than data protection. And legal protection, I mean administrative justice. So how does the government react when there has been a mistake or your case doesn't fit how they think you should have fit? And the other piece is that you can ask an independent judge to review the decision the administration made. So basically those parts of the rule of law I wanted to study. And it really is a difference from GDPR, because we have this supervisory authority, etc., but they can never quash the decision. It's a no-go. So you have to go to the administrative court, at least in the Netherlands, if you say that the decision is wrong and you want to get it away. So what's automated administrative chain decision making? Because I'm not only writing about administrative decision making, but the Netherlands, you know, we are a country, and I think it's almost unique, but everything is in change. So there is not one agency that makes a decision based on their data. They are all cooperating with each other. So it is all shared, the data. And that is called in the Netherlands chain computerization. So the problem gets a little bit different. You have data, you have algorithms, and then an administrative decision comes out. That's normally what's happening when we speak about automated decision making. Yeah, well, it looks a bit, well, down to earth. You can see it, you can explain it. So computer scientists will say, well, that's not very different from how a human makes a decision. But now we are going to add the chain effect to this decision, and then we will see that other problems arise. only 2 days ago, there was this lady in the Netherlands, and she was declared dead, administratively dead. Well, you would say that's better than be dead, but not in the administration. But for her, the problems were enormous, because within 24 hours, these data are spread around the country. All the official agencies know you are dead. So she receives many, many letters, and she has to convince all these single agencies, but I'm not dead. Yes, lady, we can all say that. So you see, the problem of all the reuse of information is based on the idea nothing goes wrong, and this was a human error, but because of the chain effect, it was a very large effect. So then we have another thing, the automated chain decision. That means that this decision is, well, reused in data, and as data, it's one of the large the databases used for another decision. So now we have an automated chain decision. To add a little complexity, daily life complexity, we are talking about 2 different agencies in 2 different time schedules. So meaning for administrative lawyers around you, you have like 6 weeks, for instance, to file an appeal against the decision made by the administrative agency that made the decision. But as you can see from this chart, if you notice it like in 10 weeks, because the other decision built its decision on the other decision, you were too late to ask for a review. So legally, you have no grounds to ask for quashing the decision. And Dutch government arranged this very smart, because it said in the law that if I want to go to the administrative agency B, he cannot change it. So I have to go. Yeah. So I'm going to stress this sentence. But you see the problem, right? So I cannot appeal to the agency to quash the decision. That's not correct. In the Netherlands, it's a necessity. So the reallocation of money in the Netherlands is done by computers only. So we pay taxes every month, and it's reallocated in benefits, very soon. 2 weak links in the study was that the automated decision making, the information was not available. It was too deeply programmed, it's too old, it's legacy. So I couldn't assess if government took care of implementing the law according to the rules and according to the principles. And the chain effect means that you get into trouble, so legal protection has diminished. And very, well, not very nice thing that I discovered is that the law doesn't really is a factor for people who are building these systems. So you could say the question was how to regulate. Well, as a lawyer, I don't have much other instruments than think about the law, while at the same time the conclusion was that the law was not very important for the people in administration. So more or less, it comes down to the people who work at the administration, so I think it's a change we need from attitude, people who are working in the agencies. We will have to build Kafka buttons, so a button to push whenever a case is that odd, we couldn't foresee it. And we have to follow France, and in France they annul the decisions if you don't comply with the rules. And that's a bit, that's how the government cannot build very expensive systems without a business case. So I thought, let's add a business case. Digital literacy. Yes. Not for you, of course, because you are, of course, all very digital literate, but please advise to the people in your country to follow AI courses. And we have in the Netherlands free online courses. Oh, yes.
Regulate algorithms. Yeah, okay.
Did you all the drawing yourself?
No.
Impressive drawing.
Yeah.
Very nice. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for being here at Friday, 5 p.m. I've seen drinks being served, so you can sit down. It's still not time for drinks. Anyway, when you get home tonight and you open your Netflix, you're going to see recommendations for what to watch next, right? And in most cases, this prediction is accurate, but sometimes it's way off and you don't really want to see that stupid comedy of some sort. So we are aware of algorithms and their errors, but imagine this happening in government and in public services, right? Like health, education, taxation, or even if you're alive or dead. So it seems kind of like we are aware of errors, but there's been a deployment of algorithms in public services already without necessarily having a framework or some sort of a checklist to make sure that that comedy, or in that sense being alive, has a procedure to follow. So what is happening now is we see these examples, and I'm going to build on the buzz that is in Brussels. Maybe you've read about facial recognition that is being deployed in many countries. So according to Algorithm Watch, that's being in 10 EU countries, with 8 considering introducing facial recognition. So this is something that Denmark has already done in January, I think a few weeks ago, to actually map the potential bullies at the football game. And we have this type of algorithms being used in UK for visa applications, for detecting child abuse, and so on. But the errors are there, and what's happening at the moment is that researchers and policymakers are considering to kind of have the impact assessment sort of framework. You've heard about the GDPR, which has been introduced in 2018, and already in there you have some directions to take when it comes to algorithms in any type of services in both public and private sectors, where data collectors need to make public or users aware that they're using this type of algorithms. But what is important is there to see that there's a body of guidelines being produced by European institutions, starting with the Parliament in 2017, which proposed the Agency for Robotics and AI, and building on top of that, recently there was last year, communication. Actually, 2018 communication on the AI, followed by trustworthiness of AI. In those documents, you already have directions for the regulation, which amplifies to kind of have the mechanisms of detecting of usage of algorithm in decision-making processes. Then the opportunity to track the data that is being used in those systems, and then third, the public access to that system. So it's just a guidelines, it's still not a regulation, but it's a starting point for the discussions that are being made, which again have been moved from the general data protection. You're kind of looking confused. Am I making sense at this point? Yeah, okay. Yeah, if it's too boring, you want to go and skip to Netflix again, just not. But what is happening is the need of, as I said, impact assessment. And what I found very, very interesting is what came out of the 2019 communications from the European Commission, which was the document assessing trustworthiness of AI. What they propose is 63 different questions that can be used to assess if algorithms are going to make errors or bias. When it comes to bias, I think everybody knows the example from US, where police departments are using algorithms to detect potential criminals, and it's sadly not working in favor of people of color. So I think this is the first step where we have the assessment of this type of technology within the government bodies and the private sector as well. And I like what I see is that these discussions are moving towards the human rights and regulation of human rights, starting from Toronto Declaration in 2018, which is kind of a mainstream approach of actually having equality when it comes to being processed by algorithms or machine learning. And a lot of that I can see in communications coming from the European institutions, which are based on human-centric approach, right? So we need to make sure that whenever we have automated systems and algorithms, that there's human involved in that loop. Building on that, I want to point out a good example from New Zealand, which actually started assessing their own governmental agencies to kind of see which type of systems they're using, if they're automated system using algorithms, and then how is this going to be employed in the future. I think Germany did something similar. I'm not sure if there's a review process of governmental usage of algorithms in other countries, so maybe you can help me with that. But I think that builds on other kind of nice summary that is coming from AI Now Institute from New York University, which kind of summed up recommendations which I think build on these 63 questions from the Commission, which are tasking public bodies and governments to first make an assessment of algorithms that they use and future use. Then second, which is also a question for you, to have the third-party external agency being in control and reviewing this type of automated systems regularly. Third, to make publicly known that this type of systems are employed, and then actually to proceed on responding to comments from public if they have any concerns. And the fifth is, I think you maybe mentioned something, when an individual is affected by such system, to have mechanisms, so the government has mechanisms for those individuals to kind of make a complaint and to make sure that they are respected and then decision is made in their favor. Because there's plenty of examples. I think you mentioned taxation. I think it was in Australia that 2.5 million people were actually affected by the algorithm and didn't get support. In America, it was in the healthcare system where people lose the taker. So there's a lot of examples where it's similar to Netflix. You have the show that you don't want to see. Well, this impacts people's lives. But again, there are some guidelines and frameworks with exact checklists. And I like something that I've seen, it's Ethical Toolkit from GovX, also from US, which is a more comprehensive assessment of algorithms being used by the governments. I mentioned speculation about facial recognition, so if you're reading Politico, you probably came across of the white paper that leaked from the Commission, and there in that part, may or may not, governments will need to actually make sure that they're respecting the minimum requirements for the systems that are employing algorithms in health, transportation, and so on. So fun stuff, right? And there's a interesting thing about black box and using technologies by, we don't want to hear you singing. So, but we can discuss this more into detail. But the point is that I see progress in shifting from, as you say, data into having testing pilots with some sort of a guidelines and a checklist that governmental bodies can use to ensure that there's no discrimination and bias.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's it. If you later on will interrupt, you always have to talk through the microphone because it's recorded. If you don't use the microphone, you just see some mouth moving, but you don't hear anything. That's why I was checking whether I could be heard. So the next speaker is Helene.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's working. Thank you very much, Arno. I'm speaking from a government perspective, which is rather unusual in such conferences, because governments are usually seen as, well, not the bad guys, but the guys who don't understand things, which is really okay. But I would like to explain a little bit about how things work in a government. So you won't hear me say very much about AI itself or details. I mean, I leave that to my distinguished colleagues. But I'd rather prefer to, to give you a couple of key takeaways. I prepared a slide deck, I have to be honest, where I wanted to say this is what the Netherlands is doing, but I think, no, I do away with that, and I'm going to tell you how regulation works. And we had a minister, a very good one actually, at the Ministry of the Interior. His name was Donner. And he said, you don't want to know how sausages are made, but the sausage tastes really good, I can tell you. And I think he was quite right. So legislators are like people, regulators are like people. And well, with that, I would say almost very open doors come as key takeaways, but still probably interesting to repeat, is that when you think about regulation of AI, context is everything. And I really mean everything. So how do you regulate AI? Well, there are many topics in a society you have to regulate. And I wonder whether that is very different when it comes to AI. You can say, regulator, you make law, but regulation comprises so much more. Law, but also there are a raft of policy instruments you can think of, like impact assessments, they crossed a couple of times already, soft law instruments, cooperations, cross-border cooperations between supervisory authorities or other supervisory authorities, between civil servants as well. You have international organizations, stakeholders involvement. You can think about internet consultation. That's what we in principle standardly do in the Netherlands. So whenever we develop a law, it's put on the internet and everybody can shoot on it. And it's very interesting. We get very good responses, but yeah, sometimes we wonder, well, where is academia? So we hope that whenever we put AI regulation, legislation on screen, we hope that you massively respond. Because we are really dependent upon good cooperation. So, when you talk about laws, you have high-level law and low-level law. And let's say high-level law is, for instance, fundamental rights. They're on top of the legal hierarchy in the Netherlands, at least, in the legal system. And then you have ordinary laws, and then you have lower laws going into guidelines, soft law, standard setting, whatsoever. And all these things, they provide you with buttons that you can turn and push. And you have to find a sort of, well, you have to, I won't say a balance, but it's rather a calibration of, well, how do you use these things to appropriately arrange the norms? So that's rather a procedural approach that I'm pushing here, but I think this procedural approach is incredibly important. I mean, substance is much, but substance and procedure make things happen. And that is what you try to arrange from a governmental perspective. I said high-level law and lower level. I think a regulator should head for both, probably. I think on a higher level, you should set the high-level principles and approaches, and in lower levels, you can go into details. And that is what we are, for instance, doing now. So one of the ministries is developing procedural guidelines to safeguard the quality of AI, for instance. And if I tell you that these are based on accountability, explainability, auditability, documentation obligations, validation of results, guarantee the testability of things, well, that is not new to you. We find this all in the GDPR. But the GDPR does not entail a completely new principles, but they are put in a certain perspective where we thought, hey, this is urgent, this needs to be regulated. But these principles, they will now, in the next step, be operationalized into clear and practical guidelines for both AI developers and designers and policy AI developers and designers. Because, coming back to the context, I think it's really important to realize that you don't, as an AI systems designer, you don't do your work in an isolated environment. You're always interacting with a policymaker or a legislator. So what I want to say is there should be a proper dialogue between the two worlds. And I realize that one of the challenges is to bring those together. But you can do that through developing these guidelines, the procedural guidelines I was just talking about. And that's what happened. That's what is happening currently in the Ministry of Justice. And to give you one example, some ideas that already came out is that explainability of AI for a government. When a government is accountable, it has to account vis-à-vis the parliament. Well, I can tell you, they are rather critical at the minute, and rightly so. So we also need a parliament to keep the politicians sharp. and explainability of AI. Well, if it's not explainable, well, then you shouldn't use it as a rule. Maybe there are circumstances where you can account for using it, but that is probably not in the areas where AI hurts people or treats a person's fundamental rights and freedoms, for instance, or other legitimate interests. So my impression is pretty much that we have, with large communities, we are standing at a point where we are staring down, or up, or whatever, how you want to put it, but next steps need to be taken. And I think that's what we are starting to do now in our government with the procedural guidelines that I just mentioned. And we don't do that just by ourselves. You do that through new approaches in regulatory environments. For instance, you start sandboxing. I think you have heard about that before. We organize labs with scientists and policymakers. We are also preparing impact assessments. One of the things we want to start off in the Netherlands is the development of a fundamental rights impact assessment. And that must be really practical for those who who have to make use of this. 7 years ago, we were one of the countries that started to develop a privacy impact assessment. That became obligatory for the entire national government, and it has functioned quite well. And also other actors, other public actors, they started to embrace the thing. And we also saw, for instance, that the supervisory authority, we also involved that party in the development of that fundamental right, in that privacy impact assessment. And we want to do the same with our College for Fundamental Rights and Freedoms. Yeah, so that is, I addressed a lot of things already. Yeah, so a short step back to the policy and the cooperation between policy and AI designers. I think that is incredibly important to realize that those have to cooperate. If you have a policy cycle where you initiate, you design, you develop, you test, you deploy, you evaluate, and you reinvent your policy, in every step AI can be involved. And you have to go and go through the risks, but also see potential opportunities, because AI can help you, for instance, in supervisory work. So I think there are lots of opportunities, and we have to map them out, and that's what we are starting with. And I think it's time to take the step forward, and we are doing that in seeking to operationalize things in practical manners.
Excellent.
So no singing.
And the last speaker of this panel, Jennifer, please.
Okay, thank you, Arno. So I think, first of all, I want to say that I think it's really important to understand the increasing use of automated decision-making in government in its context. And I say context, I think, differently to how Helene was using it. I think we need to understand that reforms in the public sector of many countries over the last few decades have introduced market logic deep into public administration, emphasizing competition and private management and performance metrics and efficiency and cost saving. And into this mix has more recently come a sort of quasi-ideological belief in the supposedly transformational power of data gathering and analytics technologies. Jose Van Dyke calls it dataism. Questionable assumptions and utopian beliefs about automation's potential to bring increased accuracy, reduced bias, and an improved ability to spot patterns often play into automation strategies, particularly those that focus on machine learning. In government specifically, however, cost efficiency, cost saving, and unfounded techno-utopian beliefs aren't things that should be prioritised above others. The law and the interests of good government hold other values and requirements and standards to be more important. The rule of law is fundamental. While private individuals and the private sector are generally free to act within the bounds of the law, the public sector can typically only act with a legal authority and only within permitted parameters. Principles of transparency and accountability, procedural fairness, human rights, including, very importantly, socioeconomic rights and non-discrimination, as well as promoting social cohesion and equality, should also be paramount. And we have to be ready to uphold those things in the face of automation and digitalisation. While government shouldn't be unnecessarily wasteful with public resources, those overriding principles and priorities of the rule of law, human rights and broader public values must be upheld in the face of automation. The failure to properly prioritise these values in public sector automation means that negative consequences have begun and will continue to manifest, particularly for the more vulnerable in society, such as those navigating the immigration or welfare system. Indeed, the need to maintain the rule of law and standards of good government is particularly acute, given that it will often be the more vulnerable in society who will be subjected to public sector automated decision-making. Across countries, automated systems are already being used in areas including policing, healthcare, social services, child welfare, calculating and paying welfare benefits, risk scoring and fraud detection. Elsewhere, automation is used in biometric identity verification, assessing eligibility for welfare, and need classification, among other areas of public service. Philip Alston, who was the UN's Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, assessed the increasing digitalisation of welfare in countries including the US and the UK. He reported that across countries, ideological pursuits are often hidden behind the supposed scientific statistical neutrality of automated systems. This, he concludes, conceal values and assumptions which, as he put it, are far removed from and may be antithetical to the principles of human rights. And I've had numerous conversations with people working on projects in various areas across government in the UK who have looked absolutely baffled when I've asked how they're going to ensure that digitalisation and automation programmes that they're going to be part of can meet the standards of administrative law. It simply hasn't occurred to them. There are often similar reactions when I mention GDPR and data protection law, and also even things like non-discrimination law. So I would argue that public sector automation programmes must recentre the rule of law and fundamentals of good government, including transparency, accountability, non-discrimination and human rights. We have to remember that we operate under the rule of law, not the rule of technology, and law must remain the reference point. What technology can and can't do must not be allowed to become the standard by which we evaluate developments in the public sector. But law needs reform to ensure that it can sufficiently confront challenges of automation, set adequate standards, and provide for effective accountability and oversight mechanisms. Existing administrative, non-discrimination and data protection law provides a basis for moving forward, but it's not sufficient. Arguably, due to systemic problems with opacity, errors, bias in decision-making and discrimination, as well as the risk of things like automation bias, blunting oversight, we should require higher standards for automated systems than we do for humans. Given the limitations of existing laws and oversight mechanisms, as well as the potential impact on vulnerable members of society, I would argue for a comprehensive legislative framework to address public sector automation and recentre the rule of law, human rights and fundamentals of good government. These frameworks should set out in law when automated decision-making can be used and what it can and can't involve. Red lines are absolutely crucial for protecting people. There are some areas in which we simply should not use automation. Legislation should also establish effective procedural and substantive safeguards in the design, deployment and use of automated systems to protect individuals and their rights, freedoms and interests, including socioeconomic rights. Future legislation could, for instance, include limits on what kinds of data could be used in automated public sector decision-making and for what purposes. It should provide greater space for automated decisions to be challenged through straightforward mechanisms in a timely manner. And it should require proper testing and auditing of socio-technical processes to root out and address errors, biases and other flaws before they are deployed. Agile testing after deployment or test and learn processes, as have been used in some cases in the UK, are simply not appropriate for this. It's not acceptable to deploy substandard systems on vulnerable members of the public in the hope that they can be improved over time. To facilitate effective oversight and improve accountability, public bodies must open themselves up to scrutiny. Future law should require transparency, not just of technical systems themselves, but of the wider socio-technical processes of which they're a product and in which they're embedded. Not because I think transparency is by itself greatly beneficial, it's not necessarily, but because targeted transparency obligations and mechanisms work to support and enable accountability, oversight and redress. I therefore argue that the concept of reviewability should be at the heart of the legal regime. Reviewability, as I propose it, involves socio-technical processes that are designed to expose the information required to audit, review and assess their design, operation, deployment and use for compliance with legal requirements, human rights and wider principles of good government. Governments cannot be allowed to hide the details of their systems behind confidentiality clauses or intellectual property claims. Demanding reviewable systems means requiring auditing, record keeping and disclosure of information at all stages of automated decision making, from the commissioning and procurement of systems to model building, training and testing, through to deployment and use of automated systems and its consequences. This information should be made available either publicly to the subjects of decisions or to oversight bodies as appropriate on where automated systems are being used, on what they involve, and on the training, testing, evaluating and auditing of systems. Those subject to decisions should at least be told what information relating to them is being processed, including any proxies and inferences, and the collection of aggregate data on the treatment of protected characteristics in decision-making could also be required. I'm not at all opposed to automation in the public sector in principle, but I strongly argue that legislative responses are urgently required to ensure a renewed focus on the rule of law, human rights and fundamental principles of good government in the design, deployment and use of automated decision-making in the public sector. And if a technology can't do what the law requires, then the answer is simple: don't use the technology. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Hello. I'm very glad everyone stick to their time limit, so we have plenty of time to discuss this interesting topic where we got lots of food for thoughts being fed by this wonderful panel. So the floor is yours, basically. But I don't see a microphone. Or
No,
is
this is the microphone.
this is the microphone. Okay. Sorry.
I stole it.
Ah, and you're going to help me.
Take it back to the people. Okay, well, thank you for this wonderful panel, and thanks for keeping the energy up at the end of the, 4 days of a marathon at CPDP. My question is about basically technologies that are coming into the public sector not because they're being procured by the public sector, but that are inserting themselves into the public sector. And the example that I have to give is, for example, traffic beating apps. When I talk with traffic engineers in the Netherlands, they say for years they've been doing optimization, which most of these systems do as well. However, when they do optimization as public sector employees or researchers, they optimize for the infrastructure and the public good. And what we have with these new systems that are coming in, that, for example, allow people to beat traffic jams on freeways by using surface roads, is that they're re-optimizing the infrastructure for their own users while externalizing negative effects of that on the general population. So what we see these new companies doing is, so to say, entering the public sector or using the public infrastructure kind of sideways through their user base. And in the process, they're redefining the public welfare function of infrastructures. And I don't know that the mechanisms that we have, anywhere from procurement to transparency to accountability, is actually sufficient to address, on the one hand, individual companies doing this, but you can also imagine that there's not one application that's doing this, so there are multiple applications that are all optimizing or re-optimizing or reconfiguring public welfare function in their own interest. And then in the interaction, there's a lot of mess that happens that again gets externalized onto populations and public infrastructures. So I wonder if you have looked at any of these questions, and is it overreach for public institutions to address these applications? And also we've kind of heard in the discussions in the last days, especially in cities or municipalities or regions which have been suffering under austerity measures, coming up against these applications with global capital and global power seems to be a losing game. So one of the things that happens is that this becomes a sideways entry to become part of the public offering. So I wonder what you have to say about these developments. Thank you.
I can only refer to my knowledge of the city of Amsterdam, who has suffered these problems because the infrastructure and was totally ignored. So the main roads they want to use to get the people safe through the city were totally ignored by all the planning systems and the algorithms that worked the other way around. So suddenly, heavy traffic was signaled along schools, for instance, totally inappropriate, and making the work of all the infrastructure engineers useless. So what they did was add them to the table, invite them to the table. And so they needed to discuss. And can you imagine you working for like Amsterdam is still a very large city, but can you imagine asking Google to your office and explain to them, well, we kind of have a little trouble with what you're doing. And they did, and that turned the other way around because they said, oh my gosh, we are discussing algorithms with all these companies, Airbnb, Uber, etc. But how about our own algorithms? And that's how they turned it totally around and start looking at their own algorithms too. But this needs to be addressed at a higher level, yeah. But talking is the first.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's excellent questions. I think the two that are, most interesting to me from that is the question of whether it's overreach for public bodies to look at these issues. I don't think it is at all. I think public bodies should absolutely be looking at these issues. And I think the second part that was really interesting to me was whether or not this is a losing game in the face of sort of global capital and corporate power. I think so far it has been a losing game, as it has generally been against sort of tech and big tech more generally. But I think that's because governments basically aren't even playing the game. We've seen such a lack of intervention in these things, such a lack of actual useful regulation, or even where we have regulation enforcement across tech generally. And until governments wise up and actually start getting in the game, they're always going to lose. And it's completely indefensible, I think, to be following these kind of deeply neoliberal logics of deregulation and hands-off kind of stuff, when the whole of society is being quite rapidly transformed and captured by big multinational corporations. Governments have completely dropped the ball and they need to get involved.
Yeah, one of the challenges is also that it involves cross-border judicial questions, which makes regulation also quite challenging, I can tell you. Well, these are typical things you might want to address at European level at least. But yeah, I very much agree with what Marlies has just said and Jennifer. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much for this panel about the topic of legal decision in justice, but also in administrative activity. I think it's very different. And I appreciate what you said about assessment, impact assessment, but I have really some doubts about what is referential and what is a type of algorithm or decision model you use. Because I think we have a panel this morning about personhood of AI, and at this we take the opportunity to try to differentiate different type of algorithm. For example, 20 years ago, maybe more, 30 years ago, alas, decision-making process, automated decision-making process was totally different because it was based on symbolic language. It means that we could understand every rule. Now we are in a turn, as we call that. A turn, this turn is about algorithmic decision. And to me and to a lot of people, especially in France, we discuss a lot of that because we are very cautious about the jurisprudence about legal administrative decision. It's totally controlled by the judge, and a lot of conditions must be respected. It has nothing to do with digital constraints. It's something inside the regime of the decision. For example, recours pour excès de pouvoir means that you have to control the external condition. Is the decision maker is competent, and what is about the competence when you use an algorithm? So it's very interesting to really specify. If we are talking about algorithm, this second generation of decision-making process, or if we are talking about the first, because the first was, yes, it was totally different question, because it's really transparency is really a little, as we said, it's not at all transparency. And when it's transparency, and transparency is not only a question of machine or algorithm. If we talk with a mathematician, it's impossible when you use non-supervised data in a machine learning. It is impossible to know exactly what type of data has been used for the decision. So it's totally aberrant for a lawyer, you know. And especially also the decision, the explanation, the motivation, which is so important in law. It has nothing to do with civil rights. It's just administrative law. And this motivation is totally absent by an algorithm. It cannot do anything. Or you ask for other people to add some new motivation, but it's not a motivation extracted for the decision-making process. And for the result, it's exactly the same problem. So data, mechanism of reasoning, and also result, we cannot do an action against a decision if we don't know the reason why it has been made and so on. So to me, but not only to me, really, currently, we think that to use an algorithm for administrative decision or for, and of course, for justice is totally illegal. Totally illegal. We cannot do, and we can prove that. Okay. So we have to do something in impact assessment, I agree, but what?
So I think we have to remember these aren't just technical systems, they're socio-technical systems and processes. For the most part, to oversee their use and their deployment, we don't need to know what's going inside the technical system itself. We don't need to know what the mechanism of reasoning is, and we don't need explanations of the actual technical processes. We need to look at the broader socio-technical process. And I don't believe in transparency generally. I want socio-technical processes to record and expose the information that you need to be able to assess them for compliance with legal requirements, human rights principles, and other things that are relevant to this, including things like administrative law. I don't think we need explanations for the most part. We need much more useful interventions about the broader socio-technical process.
Well, maybe a word about, I said a word about fundamental rights impact assessments. I would then say, well, various models have been developed, but it's really time to take the next step and to work them out in detailed questionnaires. And maybe you have a different questionnaire for algorithm E and another one for algorithm B or C or D. So you can specify that at lower levels, but you have to become very specific. And that is really the next step we are working on. So, and everybody has to work on, yeah.
I like the, and I'm very brief. In my thinking about the regulation of algorithms, I distinguish three possible ways you can, depending on the context and the algorithm. One is not regulate at all. The second is think about safeguards. And the third is prohibition. So I think there are algorithms based on the context or based on the kind of type of algorithm we should prohibit. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the interesting insights. I'm a computer scientist myself, so sorry if I really focus on the technical details here. I kind of want to react to what you said on we shouldn't look at on a technical level what exactly the algorithm does, but rather on a higher socioeconomic level. I have to object to that because even if on a higher level we set down some rules that are non-discriminatory and are according to what we want as a society, then still the devil is in the details. And even despite those rules, in the technicalities, we could still have discrimination. We could still have terrible decision making. And then the second thing that I want to point out is I think we're conflating some things about automated decision making in one place done by algorithms based on rules that were still put down by humans. In your example, when someone is dead, they shouldn't be able to do some kind of things, as opposed to automated decision making by AI, where AI is either a source of truth or a principal decision maker. So yeah, I think we should draw that distinction. Do you agree?
Yeah, I'm very agitated every time people say that automated decision making and then immediately refer to machine learning. So for me, it's indeed very important to stress that they are both different and that they pose different challenges as well. I was thinking I'm thinking a lot how to distinguish them. So I define it normally programmed by humans, the algorithms programmed by humans and the learning algorithms. It's a kind of way like I, as a lawyer, try to fit within the technology. It's difficult. There are even legal scholars, and I hate what they are doing. They are claiming, yes, we have dumb algorithms and smart algorithms. So for me, those are different. They pose different challenges, but I'm not buying the fact that the rule, if you have the first generation AI, that those are transparent, because I've looked for it and they are totally intransparent. And that says to me, okay, maybe we are not ready yet for the second generation.
I mean, I can just wrap up the previous question and just add to yours. So again, there are a list of questions, there are like guidelines, and there are like specific actions that different institutions are asking public sector to do in order to understand data a bit better. So it's the technological complexity is not an excuse for providing information, so it needs to be out there. Coming back to our question of exposing code, and that's been like an issue with the regulation, it's intellectual property. The best example that I found is in the air traffic industry, right, and operating planes. So you don't just go ahead and launch that, sit on that plane and just go up in the air, and you don't know on what type of magic that works. But you have independent agencies and regulators who look into different aspects of air traffic. So you won't necessarily go into Boeing patents, but you would have a board of experts who would confirm the trustworthiness of such technology. I also, when you said we shouldn't use technology if we cannot, test it properly, I agree to some extent, but from the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, you can actually draw the conclusion that algorithms being better than humans in drawing conclusions, human race would need to rely on technology in order to reach ultimate equality, meaning that systems would be better at identifying gaps and biases and make society a bit better. So we can not go that far, but I found an estimate of this international type of guidelines and rules. It will take 2 to 4 years to kind of reach the agreement which would respect the human rights and would allow deployment of technology that it's viable. So yeah, back to your question, yes, I think that there should be a group of people seeing into code and understanding how that code works. And again, this has been a part of GDPR to some extent, and some of the communication from the Commission communication already. But there are questions, like 63 questions, that actually go through different sets of detecting of algorithm transparency and accountability.
Can I just say, I think you're wrong, obviously, but I think you're wrong because you make a mistake that computer scientists often make. The thing is that the law doesn't regulate machines. The law regulates the actions of natural and legal persons. Fundamentally, if a decision is discriminatory, it doesn't matter how you got to that decision. It doesn't matter what the technical system is. What matters is that the decision is discriminatory. Fundamentally, the technical system is basically irrelevant to that question. And I think if we're using the systems that produce discriminatory decisions, it does not matter what kind of technical system you're using. What matters is the discrimination.
Yeah, and it goes back to having like the external auditors to test those systems. So you might think that the system is correct and you can continue with deploying it, but there needs to be a cross-check of that system from independent body. I mean, in your terms, in the technology, you have the data that you feed the system, but then you also need to have the testing data that you feed the same system to see if there are errors, right?
Yeah, it's interesting that he uses the plane example because I used it in the past to explain to explain what we as lawyers want. Because if a plane used a neural network and landed safely, you're not interested in why it landed safely. You're just satisfied that it landed safely. But in law, it's totally different. If you have an outcome of a decision or whatever, you want to know why. So it's funny that I use this example. You used it in a correct way. I'm not opposing you or whatever, but it was funny that I made this, in particular in the context of neural networks before there were deep learning. So, yes, please.
Yes, I'm coming from Japan and now stay in Germany because of I want to focus on the digital zero and the Verwaltung from now on. So I have two questions. One is what is about legitimacy or their competence of the making rules? Because sometimes if we use the algorithm into the administration process, we also have the process for the what the element can choose or not, or how deep or it's a very important point to make a legal system to something permission, for example, the child care permission or something like that. In Japan, to permit equality, it's very complicated. So some local government want to use machine process, not machine learning, but rule into the machine, then calculate about this. But it has two problems. One is the transparency you said, but the other thing is this actually the translate into the machine, the element or ways or something like that. So if it's different, the machine typist and the legal sentence is different. It's kind of the breach of the constitutional competence, I think. So what think about this kind of problem and moreover, I want to ask you what is the sandbox of the regulation, this kind of problem? Because not only for the arrow for something like something, but inside the administration, what means the sandbox system for the inside administration system?
Shall I address the first and then you the sandbox? Yeah, if you transform legal rules into programming rules, that's very interesting because they have to make them very binary. So the thing that with language, the beauty of language, is that it can mean different things to different people, and it can evolve through the years. You don't have it once you are programming it because it's like that forever. And it cannot evolve. That's a huge issue. So people are saying nowadays, and for instance, you have this professor in Oslo, he says, if I want to see how the government works, give me the source code, and then I'll know it. Because we all depend now heavily on these systems. And what we see in the Netherlands is that the legislation is as well made in order to automate the execution. So legislation gets very yes or no, very binary legislation. So they are trying to avoid individual circumstances because then, well, the efficiency of the system runs out. So you have to bring in checks and balances maybe prior the decision or right after the decision.
Yeah, to follow up on what Marlies said, it's incredibly important to keep in mind that human life is not often not binary. and that the law allows for black letter law and the spirit of the law and something in between. And I think we often, very often deal with the things in between. And we should really keep track on that. Well, I'm currently working in the ministry for a group which calls itself New Technologies, Public Values and Fundamental Rights. So I think this is an incredibly important public value that where we will raise flags. I mean, as an advisor, as a policymaker, I can discuss things with people. So maybe for a more practical perspective on this, but this is how things should work and would work. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful panel. My name is Divij. I'm a Mozilla Tech Policy Fellow from India. A lot of the discussion we have around governing algorithms and the kind of regulatory processes we've seen so far is about improving their efficiency, removing bias from the algorithm or the system. I'm wondering if there's a separate framework or a separate lens from which we can kind of see this, and I think that it kind of maps onto the current moment we're having around facial recognition, which is to specifically center the social and political context in which they're deployed. So no matter how perfect or wonderful the algorithmic system we have, the technology is creating a certain form of affordance which radically changes, the power relationships depending on how it's being deployed. And facial recognition is the police and the citizen. In welfare rights, it's this, again, welfare systems and the state and the citizen relationship, which is being redefined, the kind of ambiguities and uncertainties which could often help citizens in that context are again being changed. So even if you have a perfect welfare delivery system placed within that kind of power structure, it's not going to necessarily result in fundamental rights being preserved in that context. So is there a frame of do you think there's kind of a necessity to shift that conversation? Is there a possibility, and is there a lens to examine it from that point of view?
I think if I never hear the word efficiency again, I'll be really happy, because it's just a deeply neoliberal logic that obscures far more important questions that we don't talk about enough. I think even bias as a frame is broken as well. I mean, people are happy for us to talk about bias because then we're not talking about actually unlawful things like discrimination. You're right that these algorithms and the way that they're used produces serious effects in terms of power relations. They empower people, they disempower others. They're inherently normative, they're not neutral. They have significant ordering effects on society. And until we get to talking about those things that actually matter and talk about things like efficiency and bias that are completely fundamentally irrelevant when you get down to it, I think we're completely missing the point of what we should be talking about.
I would like to add on this also, again, a public value. Efficiency is a public value, and speed and everything. But there's so much more. And one of the things I'd like to see back in our fundamental rights impact assessment is that people are starting to wonder, am I using it in a proportionate way? And that's where all these public values and fundamental rights have to be considered and calibrated and explained why the balance is going to the left or to the right. And you really have to account for it for every context in which for which you design a certain policy or a law. So that's where we should go to. And we had the chance, the opportunity to practice with a privacy impact assessment, and I think the next stage should be a fundamental rights impact assessment. And I realize it takes time, and there's administrative burdens involved. But there's also a public value to have an administrative burden, because you want people to think through things. And this morning in a panel, that's maybe a bit of a frustration, but what I don't want to hear anymore in line with the bias thing is that legislation is slow. Well, let me tell you, legislation is slow for very, very good reasons. There's a public value in it. And I don't have to tell you why, I think, but there's many people involved, and you want a law to find a basis. It must be embraced by society. Otherwise, a law is worthless. And it's put aside, and you don't want that as a regulator.
No, and just snowballing on that, I think one point is the increasing the algorithm literacy within public and different groups. And I think, I'm not sure if it's Estonia or Finland, is working with universities to make the courses on Finland.
Okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
I immediately come in because you have in Finnish example elements of AI. It's a national course, you can follow it.
Precisely, yeah,
it's
that's
in
my point.
every EU language translated. However, the Dutch, well, it was too heavy for them. We need films, we need clips, we need entertainment. So we did a Dutch version, and we have subtitled it as well in English. So you can, if you like entertainment, you can follow the national AI course.
Yeah, so when you get that Netflix recommendation that you don't like, just go to Finland course on algorithms.
Yeah.
Yes.
Shankar Narayan, formerly with the ACLU in Seattle, now with Create Our Future. I just wanted to address the point from the previous question. I think this has been a great discussion, and it's touched on, I think, a lot of the dynamics in this space, including this tension between transparency and accountability. And also, I think this really fundamental point that every technology is deployed into a matrix of power, and you can't actually ignore how it shifts those power relationships. But I wanted to add to the discussion that last year in Seattle and in Washington State, the first algorithmic accountability bill was introduced, and that bill included an algorithmic accountability assessment that made explicit that the assessment of impact on civil liberties would actually be taken with particular respect to historically over-impacted communities, right? So that brought in this idea of a matrix of power. And in addition to that procedural piece, which is supposed to happen before an algorithm ever gets deployed, there's a substantive piece that relies on disproportionate impact on certain communities. We think it's already illegal under our Constitution and our law against discrimination, but this makes that explicit, and we're hoping we've revised it this year, and we're hoping to actually pass it.
Yeah,
So
and
we'd love to
I've
keep
seen
the
it
dialogue.
because I was doing research, but I don't like to bring a lot of examples from US, and it's publicly available, so it's a kind of nice form when you have also the questions that I'm always mentioning of assessing. So that's, thanks for bringing that up. That's also a nice guidance towards how governments can assess technologies that use.
That sounds excellent, and I think every algorithmic accountability thing should probably have that, because that sounds great, yeah.
Does anyone know if the people with the also play a band, or are they still walking around?
They're singing.
They're singing.
I want to wrap up then. I want to thank everyone. It was a wonderful panel, and it was interesting that the interactions came from all across the globe. So France, Japan, India, US. And one last thing I want to say before thanking the panel and thanking you as an audience is the reason I didn't start singing was also I didn't know a proper song, and I was thinking about 50 ways to regulate an algorithm, because it also has the line, the logic. It's very easy if you take it logically. But then later I was thinking, when already everything was passed, we could have this song like, I want to be at the CPDP. Maybe we can sing this when we are moving to the next room. Thank you all very much. Thank the panel. Thank you, audience.